Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back, way back, to a time when the Mediterranean world was doing surprisingly okay. So go ahead, dim the lights a little, maybe lie down, get comfortable, because nothing we're about to talk about is urgent or fast or particularly helpful to your daily life. It's just history. Slow, strange, and a little bit confusing. Tonight we begin with a mystery. Not the loud, dramatic kind. More like the historical equivalent of walking into your kitchen and realizing someone has eaten all your food, moved your furniture, and then quietly disappeared. Historians call them the Sea Peoples, which sounds dramatic and vague, because it is. No one really knows who they were. No one fully agrees where they came from. And yet, they somehow managed to stroll into one of the most advanced regions of the ancient world and politely or not so politely collapse it. So let's ease into it. Before the Sea Peoples showed up, the late Bronze Age world was actually thriving. You had powerful kingdoms stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt was doing its usual thing, building monuments, writing things down, being very proud of itself. To the north, there was the Hittite Empire, organized, structured, and deeply invested in bureaucracy, which, as we all know, is always a sign that things will eventually go wrong. Then there were the Mycenaeans in Greece, palace builders, traders, slightly dramatic, fond of gold, and scattered in between city-states, trade networks, and a whole lot of very interconnected economies. It was, in many ways, a surprisingly globalized system. Tin from one region, copper from another, luxury goods moving across seas, letters being sent between kings who referred to each other as brother, even when they absolutely did not trust each other. Everything was linked, which is lovely until something breaks. And something definitely broke. Now, if you were living around 1200 BC, you might have started noticing little things. Trade routes becoming unreliable. Cities reporting raids along the coast. Messages arriving a bit more urgently than usual. And then slowly, steadily, things began to fall apart. Entire cities were destroyed. Kingdoms vanished. Records stopped. It wasn't one big, dramatic moment. It was more like a series of quiet collapses, one after another. Like dominoes, but slower and with more confusion. And somewhere in all of this, we get our first real glimpse of the Sea Peoples. Or, at least, what we think might be them. Because here's the thing. The Sea Peoples didn't leave behind diaries. They didn't build monuments explaining their motivations. They didn't sit down and say, "Hello, we are the Sea Peoples, and this is our 5-step plan for regional disruption." No. Instead, we mostly know about them from the people they bothered, which means the Egyptians. Of course, the Egyptians wrote about everything, especially when they felt like they had won, which they always felt. So, around the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, we get inscriptions describing a group of invaders, actually multiple groups, arriving by land and by sea, where the Sea Peoples are defeated decisively, heroically, with lots of archers and very confident captions carved into stone. According to the official version, the Egyptians won. Completely. End of story. Except not really. Because even if Egypt managed to hold them off, the rest of the region didn't. The Hittite Empire? Gone. Mycenaean palaces? Destroyed. Cities across Anatolia and the Levant? abandoned or burned. It's less of a victory and more of a we survived, technically, which, to be fair, is still something. Now, let's pause for a moment, because it's very tempting to imagine the sea peoples as this single, unified force. A kind of ancient coalition sailing together, planning everything out like a very organized invasion. But that's probably not what happened. In fact, it's almost certainly not what happened. What we're likely looking at is a collection of different groups. Some displaced by climate changes. Some pushed out by conflict. Some just looking for better opportunities. Which is, relatable. Except instead of updating their LinkedIn profiles, they were collapsing civilizations. Different times. So rather than one big coordinated attack, it may have been more like waves. Groups moving into new areas, putting pressure on existing systems, causing instability, which then causes more movement, which then causes more instability. A kind of cascading effect. And when your entire world is built on interconnected trade and delicate political relationships, that kind of pressure can be enough, especially when combined with other problems. And there were definitely other problems. Climate change, for one. There's evidence suggesting that this period saw significant droughts, crop failures, food shortages, general unhappiness, which tends to make people a little more mobile, a little more desperate, a little more willing to pick up their belongings and try their luck somewhere else, even if somewhere else is already occupied by people who are not thrilled to see you. Add to that internal conflicts, economic strain, and possibly earthquakes, and suddenly, the late Bronze Age world starts looking a lot less stable and a lot more fragile. So when the sea peoples appear in the records, they may not be the sole cause of the collapse. They might just be the most visible symptom, which is honestly very on brand for history. We like clear villains. We like simple explanations. But most of the time, things fall apart for many reasons, all at once, slowly, and then all together. Now, one of the more curious details is how these groups are depicted. In Egyptian art, the sea peoples are shown with distinctive clothing, feathered headdresses, round shields, long swords. They look different, which is helpful but also slightly misleading, because artistic representation is not always perfectly accurate. Sometimes it's stylized. Sometimes it's exaggerated. Sometimes it's just what the artist felt like doing that day. But still it gives us something. A vague image of people arriving from across the sea, bringing with them not just weapons, but entire households, which raises a quiet question. Where were they planning to go? Because you don't move your entire family, your carts, your possessions, unless you're planning to stay. This wasn't just destruction. This was relocation. And that makes the whole thing feel slightly different. Slightly less like a sudden invasion and more like a slow, unstoppable shift. Of people, of cultures, of everything. And as we drift further into this story, we'll start to see what happens after the collapse. Because, as it turns out, the sea peoples didn't just disappear. Some of them stayed, settled, adapted, became part of the new world that emerged from the ruins of the old one, which is quietly fascinating. But we'll get there. For now, we're still in that moment of transition. That strange period where the old systems are failing and the new ones haven't quite formed yet. a kind of historical in-between, where everything feels uncertain and a little bit tired. So, as you settle in, maybe let your mind wander through those ancient coastlines. Burning cities in the distance, ships on the horizon, people moving, always moving, not entirely sure where they're going, but knowing they can't stay where they are. And somewhere in that slow movement, in that quiet collapse, the world changes. Not all at once, but enough. And next, we'll drift a little deeper into the identities, or at least the possible identities, of these sea peoples. Because historians, as you might expect, have opinions. Many opinions. Some of them even agree with each other, which is always exciting. But for now, just rest with the mystery. It's not going anywhere. Much like the sea peoples, who, unfortunately for the late Bronze Age, didn't either. Alright, let's just gently continue. No need to sit up. No need to focus too hard. The sea peoples are still out there, drifting around the edges of history, refusing to introduce themselves properly. Which is a bit rude, if we're being honest. So, naturally, historians have spent the last couple of centuries trying to figure out who they were, using whatever clues they could find and a fair amount of educated guessing. And sometimes not so educated guessing. But we'll keep it calm. So, let's float through a few of the usual suspects. Not in a dramatic whodunit way, more like a relaxed stroll through a very confusing lineup. First up, the Shurden, a name that sounds vaguely like Sardinia, which is convenient, because one of the most popular theories is that the Shurden came from the island of Sardinia. Now, that doesn't mean it's true, but it does mean historians looked at the name, looked at a map, and thought, well, that seems promising. And, to be fair, there is some supporting evidence. Archaeology in Sardinia shows warrior cultures, distinctive weapons, and a general willingness to get involved in things, which aligns nicely with the whole showing up in Egyptian battle scenes situation. Interestingly, the Shurden also appear earlier as mercenaries in the Egyptian army, which is a bit awkward, because it means that at some point they went from being hired help to being the problem. Classic career pivot. One minute you're working for the empire. Next minute you're invading it. It happens. Now, let's drift over to the Pele set. This is where things get a little more familiar, because many scholars connect the Pele set to the Philistines. Yes, those Philistines. The ones who show up later in biblical texts, generally causing trouble for everyone around them, including a certain very confident shepherd with a sling. But we won't get into that. We're being calm. The connection comes from similarities in name, location, and some archaeological evidence. After the collapse, we see new settlements along the southern coast of the Levant with material culture that looks different. Different pottery styles, different architecture, different vibes, really. And some of it has clear links to the Aegean world, which suggests that at least some of these people came from across the sea, which is, on brand for sea peoples. So the idea is the Pele set arrive, settle down, and eventually become the Philistines, which is less of a dramatic disappearance and more of a quiet rebranding. A historical makeover. Same people, new names, slightly different context. Now, moving along, we have the Denyen, another mysterious group. Some historians have tried to link them to the Danans a term used in Greek mythology for the Greeks, which sounds exciting because it suggests that maybe, just maybe, some of the sea peoples were actually displaced Mycenaeans, former palace dwellers now wandering the seas, looking for new homes. It's a nice idea, a bit poetic. Civilizations collapsing and their people scattering, becoming part of the forces that reshape the region. But again, the evidence is not exactly overwhelming. It's more like suggestive, a hint rather than a clear answer, which is kind of the theme here. Now, let's not forget the checker, a group that shows up in Egyptian records and then seems to settle along the Levantine coast, at a place called Dor, which, for a while, becomes their base. They don't vanish. They don't get dramatically defeated. They just settle in, set up shop, become part of the local landscape, which is honestly a very reasonable life choice. After all that traveling, you'd want to stop somewhere. Now, as we move through all these names, it's important to remember something. These groups might not have seen themselves as connected. There's no evidence of a grand alliance, no central leadership, no shared identity like, "Hello, we are the Sea Peoples. Nice to meet you." That label is modern, a kind of umbrella term created by historians to describe a very messy situation. In reality, these were likely separate groups, moving for their own reasons at their own pace, occasionally overlapping, occasionally clashing. A bit like a very slow, very chaotic traffic jam, but across the Mediterranean. And instead of honking, they were toppling civilizations. So when we say sea peoples, what we really mean is a collection of different groups that showed up at roughly the same time and caused a lot of disruption, which is less catchy, but more accurate. Now, let's gently consider another possibility. What if some of these people weren't outsiders at all? What if they were already part of the system? Local populations displaced by drought, famine, or political collapse, who then moved, regrouped, and became part of these migrating waves? Because that's the thing. When systems break down, people don't just disappear. They move. They adapt. They survive. And sometimes they become the very forces that others later describe as invaders. It's all a matter of perspective. If you're sitting comfortably in your city and a group of desperate, mobile people shows up, you're probably going to call them something dramatic. Invaders, barbarians, sea peoples, if you're feeling poetic. But from their perspective, they might just be trying to find somewhere to live, somewhere that still has food, somewhere that hasn't collapsed yet, which adds a slightly softer layer to the whole story. Still disruptive, still messy, but also very human. Now, of course, not all encounters were peaceful. There were battles. There was destruction. There were cities that didn't survive the transition. But there were also places where these groups settled, integrated, and became part of the new cultural landscape. Which is why, when we look at the centuries that follow, we don't see a completely empty world. We see a changed one. Different power structures, different cultures, different networks, but still very much alive. And in many ways shaped by the movements of these mysterious groups. Now, let's pause for a moment and just sit with that. Because it's easy to think of collapse as an ending, a dramatic final chapter, but more often it's a transition. Uncomfortable, confusing, sometimes destructive, but also transformative. Old systems fade, new ones emerge, and in between there's this strange drifting period where identities blur, borders shift, and people just keep moving. Now, returning to our sea peoples, one of the more interesting details is how they traveled. We have depictions of ships, long, narrow vessels with high prows and sterns, designed for speed and maneuverability. Not massive warships, but not exactly fishing boats either. Something in between. Flexible, practical, capable of carrying people, goods, maybe even entire families. Which again reinforces the idea that this wasn't just about raiding. It was about movement. Sustained, determined movement. Across a sea that at the time was both a barrier and a highway. Now, imagine that for a moment. Not in a dramatic way. Just quietly. Small fleets of ships moving along the coast. Stopping where they can. Avoiding where they can't, looking for places to land, to rest, to settle, and occasionally encountering resistance, because of course they did. And when they did, things didn't always go smoothly. But over time, enough of them found places to stay. Enough of them adapted. And slowly, the map of the Mediterranean began to change. Not overnight. Not all at once, but steadily. And as it changed, the memory of these movements, these disruptions became simplified, condensed, turned into a kind of historical shorthand. The sea peoples came and everything collapsed, which is convenient, but not entirely accurate. Because as we've been gently exploring, it's never just one thing. It's never just one group. It's a web of causes and effects and movements, all overlapping, all interacting. A slow, complex unfolding. Now, as we continue, we'll drift a little deeper into the consequences. What actually happened after the collapse? What did the world look like once the dust, or perhaps the sea spray, had settled? Because that's where things get quietly interesting. New kingdoms, new cultures, new ways of organizing life, all emerging from the remains of the old world. And somewhere in that transition, the sea peoples, or whatever we choose to call them, become part of the story rather than the disruption. But for now, just let the uncertainty linger. It's part of the charm, part of the slow, sleepy rhythm of this whole thing. We don't need all the answers. We're just drifting through the possibilities. And that's more than enough. All right, let's keep drifting. No rush. The ships are still somewhere on the horizon. The cities are still standing for now, and the late Bronze Age world is doing its best, which, unfortunately, isn't quite enough. Because while the sea peoples are certainly part of the story, they're not the whole story. Not even close. And if we slow things down a little and just look around, we start to notice that this world, this carefully balanced network of kingdoms and trade routes, was already under a surprising amount of pressure. The kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself loudly. It just builds, quietly, patiently, until things begin to slip. So imagine you're a ruler in one of these late Bronze Age kingdoms. You've got trade agreements, diplomatic letters, a palace full of scribes, and probably a mild headache. Because your entire system depends on things working. Ships arriving on time. Resources flowing where they need to go. neighbors staying relatively cooperative. And suddenly things start to feel unreliable. Maybe the tin shipments are delayed, which is a problem because without tin you don't get bronze. And without bronze, your weapons, your tools, your entire technological edge starts to wobble. And no one likes a wobbly empire. Then maybe the grain harvest isn't as good as it used to be. Not terrible, just not great. A little less food, a little more concern. Nothing dramatic yet, just unease. And then you get a letter from another king who is also uneasy. In fact, we actually have letters like this. From the Amarna letters, a collection of correspondence between rulers where everyone is being very polite and also quietly asking for help. One ruler writes something along the lines of, "We are dying of hunger," which is not ideal, and also not the kind of message you want to receive when your entire political system is built on stability. Now, again, this isn't happening all at once. It's gradual, which somehow makes it worse, because there's no clear moment where you can say, "Ah, yes, this is when everything went wrong." Instead, it's more like watching a structure slowly weaken. A crack here, a delay there, a missing shipment, a failed harvest, a nervous ally. And then into this already fragile situation come groups of people moving, searching, arriving. The sea peoples, or at least some of them. And suddenly the pressure increases. Coastal cities are hit first, which makes sense. They're the entry points, the places where trade flows in and out. The places that are, unfortunately, very accessible. Some are raided. Some are abandoned. Some try to hold on but can't quite manage it. And as these cities fall or weaken, the effects ripple inward. Trade routes break down further. Supplies become even less reliable. Political alliances start to strain. Because when resources are tight and communication is slow, trust becomes the bit fragile. And once trust starts to go, things tend to unravel quickly. Now, let's gently move over to the Hittite Empire, a large, organized, impressively bureaucratic state centered in Anatolia. They had archives. They had laws. They had a capital city called Hattusa, which was quite something. Walls, temples, administrative buildings, all the signs of a functioning civilization. And then suddenly, they're gone. Not in a dramatic explosion. Not with a final heroic stand. Just gone. Hattusa is abandoned. Burned, possibly. And never really reoccupied in the same way. The empire dissolves, which is a bit unsettling, because empires aren't supposed to just disappear like that. They're supposed to decline slowly, or be conquered in a clearly documented way, or at least leave behind a proper explanation. But here we get silence, which is in its own quiet way more haunting. Now, was this caused by the sea peoples? Maybe partially, but also maybe not entirely, because the Hittites were already dealing with internal issues, political struggles, economic strain, possibly even succession problems. So when external pressure arrived, they were not at their strongest. And that combination, internal weakness plus external disruption, is often enough. Now, let's drift over to the Mycenaean world. Palaces like Mycenae, Kirin's, Pylos, all centers of power, wealth, and very elaborate administrative systems. They kept records on clay tablets, detailed ones, inventories, transactions, all carefully noted, which is wonderful for historians, because it means we can see right up to the moment when things stop. And they do stop. The tablets end, the palaces burn, and the whole system collapses. Again, not necessarily in one big event, but across a span of time, with multiple sites showing signs of destruction, abandonment, or significant decline. And once those palaces are gone, the entire structure of Mycenaean society changes. Because those palaces weren't just buildings. They were hubs, administrative centers, economic engines, cultural anchors. Remove them and everything connected to them shifts or disappears. Now, here's where things get a little quietly ironic. Because while all these great powers are struggling, collapsing, or vanishing, Egypt is still standing, barely perhaps, but still there. Ramesses III fights off invasions, builds monuments, writes inscriptions about his victories. And for a moment it looks like Egypt might be, okay, the last one standing, which is a nice image. Except even Egypt begins to feel the strain. After Ramesses III, the new kingdom starts to weaken. Economic issues, internal conflicts, gradual decline, nothing sudden, just a slow fading, which means that by the time we move into the centuries after the collapse, the entire region looks very different. No more Hittite Empire, no more Mycenaean palace system. Egypt reduced in power. Trade networks simplified. Populations shifted. It's a quieter world. Less interconnected. Less centralized. And in some ways more local. Which brings us back, gently, to the Sea Peoples. Because in this new world, they're not just invaders anymore. They're participants, settlers, neighbors. Some of them establish communities along the coast. Some integrate with existing populations. Some disappear into the broader mix of cultures. And over time, their distinct identity, if it ever existed in a clear way, begins to blur. Which is why, when we look back, they feel so mysterious. So hard to pin down, because they weren't one thing. They were many things, at once. Now there's one more piece we should quietly consider, and that's climate. Because while humans tend to focus on other humans, the environment is always there, quietly influencing everything. And during this period, there's strong evidence of drought. Extended drought, reduced rainfall over years, possibly decades, which affects agriculture, which affects food supply, which affects everything. Because when people don't have enough food, they move. They migrate. They look for better conditions. And when many groups are doing that at the same time, you get pressure, movement, instability, which can then trigger conflict, which then triggers more movement, and so on. A slow, cascading chain of events. And suddenly, the idea of sea peoples becomes less about a mysterious invading force, and more about a symptom of a world under stress. A world where systems are breaking down and people are trying to adapt. Not always peacefully, but very, very humanly. Now let's just sit with that for a moment. No dramatic conclusions. No sudden revelations, just a quiet understanding that what happened around 1200 BC wasn't one single event. It was a convergence of climate, politics, economics, and movement, all coming together in a way that the existing systems couldn't quite handle. And the result was collapse. Slow, uneven, but very real. And as we continue, we'll start to explore what came after. Because after collapse comes rebuilding. Different, smaller, sometimes simpler, but still life goes on. It always does. And somewhere in that rebuilding, the echoes of the sea peoples linger. Not as a clear identity, but as part of the transformation. A quiet thread woven into the fabric of a new world. So for now, just let the old one fade. The palaces, the letters, the carefully balanced systems, all slowly slipping away. And in their place, something new begins. Not better, not worse, just different. And we'll drift into that next. All right, we'll keep going. No need to adjust your pillow. The ancient world is already doing enough adjusting for all of us. So, where were we? Yes. Everything has more or less fallen apart. Not dramatically. Not with one final, cinematic moment. Just quietly, persistently, until the systems that once held everything together no longer do. And now we're left with the aftermath, which is always a bit understated, because history textbooks tend to focus on the big empires, the grand palaces, the moments of power. But what comes after is often slower, more subtle, and in its own way a little more human. So let's just drift into that space. The world after the late Bronze Age collapse. It's around 1100 BC now, give or take. Dates are flexible as usual. And if you were to walk along the eastern Mediterranean coast, you'd notice something interesting. Or perhaps something missing. The big powers are gone. No Hittite officials organizing things. No Mycenaean palace scribes tracking inventories. Fewer grand construction projects. Less structure. Which might sound a bit bleak. But it's not entirely empty. People are still there. They didn't vanish. They just adapted. Villages continue. Small towns survive. Local leaders step in where kings once ruled. It's a quieter world. More fragmented. More personal in a way. Instead of vast empires, you get smaller communities. Instead of centralized control, you get local decision-making, which, depending on your perspective, might actually feel a bit more manageable. Or a bit more chaotic. Possibly both. Now, along the coast, especially in the southern Levant, we begin to see something new. Settlements that weren't there before. Or at least not in the same way. These are often linked to the former sea peoples. Groups like the Peleset, who, as we gently mentioned earlier, are commonly associated with the Philistines. And here, they're not invading anymore. They're settling, building homes, establishing communities, getting involved in the local economy, which is a bit of a shift from mysterious disruptors of civilization to neighbors who live down the coast and have slightly different pottery. And yes, the pottery is important, because when written records are scarce, pottery becomes surprisingly talkative. Different styles, different shapes, different decoration techniques. They all tell a story. And in these new settlements, the pottery often shows clear influences from the Aegean world, which suggests that at least some of these people did indeed come from across the sea. And they brought their habits with them, which is very relatable. No matter how far you travel, you tend to keep a few familiar things. Now, one of the key areas where this cultural blend becomes visible is in places like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, cities that will later be known as part of the Philistine Pentapolis. But at this stage, they're still forming, still developing, still figuring out what they are and what they're going to become, which is, again, a very human process. Now, if you were expecting constant conflict, endless tension, dramatic showdowns, you might be slightly disappointed, because while there is certainly friction, there's also coexistence. Trade resumes in simpler forms. Cultures mixed gradually. People adapt as they always do. It's less of a constant battle and more of a slow, sometimes awkward integration. Now, let's gently zoom out for a moment. Because while these coastal regions are adjusting, other parts of the former Bronze Age world are also reshaping themselves. In Greece, the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces leads to a period often referred to as the Greek Dark Age, which sounds dramatic. But in reality, it's more like a reduction in complexity. Fewer large structures, less writing, more localized living. It's not that everything stops. It just becomes quieter, simpler, less interconnected, which for some people might not have been entirely terrible. Less bureaucracy, fewer demands from distant rulers, more focus on local life. Of course, it also meant fewer luxuries, less long-distance trade, and fewer opportunities for grand displays of wealth. So, trade-offs. Always trade-offs. Now, over in Anatolia, where the Hittite Empire once stood, we see a similar pattern. The big centralized system is gone. But smaller states, often called Neo-Hittite kingdoms, begin to emerge. They carry on some traditions, adapt others, and continue in a more localized form. Again, not a complete break, just a transformation. And in Egypt, well, Egypt is still there, still building things, still writing things down, still very much convinced of its own importance. But even there, the power is not what it once was. The new kingdom fades gradually. Authority weakens. Resources become more limited. And Egypt transitions into a different phase, a less dominant, more inward-looking, which, after centuries of being a major player, is quite the adjustment. Now, through all of this, one thing becomes very clear. The collapse of the late Bronze Age didn't end civilization. It changed it. It shifted the balance. It altered the structures. But life continued. People farmed, traded, built, argued, celebrated, all the usual things, just in a different context. And somewhere within that new context, the legacy of the Sea Peoples quietly persists. Not as a single identity, not as a unified group, but as part of the cultural mix. A thread woven into the fabric of this new world. Now, there's one more gentle shift we should notice, and that's the emergence of iron. Because during the Bronze Age, as the name suggests, bronze was the key material, and bronze requires copper and tin, which often come from different regions, which means trade. Reliable, consistent, long-distance trade. And as we've seen, that trade network didn't survive the collapse very well. So alternatives become necessary. Enter iron. Now, iron had been known before. It's not new, but it becomes more widespread, more commonly used in the centuries following the collapse. Because iron is more accessible, more widely available. You don't need to rely on distant trade routes in the same way. You can produce it locally with the right knowledge and resources. And so, gradually, the world transitions from bronze to iron. Not overnight. Not with a dramatic announcement. Just slowly, quietly. Another shift. Another adaptation. And with that shift come new possibilities, new tools, new weapons, new ways of organizing societies, all building on the foundations or the ruins of what came before. Now, as we drift through this post-collapse world, it's worth remembering that for the people living through it, this wasn't history. It was just life. They didn't know they were in a transitional period. They didn't label it a collapse. They were just responding, adapting, doing what they needed to do to get through, which is, in its own way, quietly reassuring. Because even in times of uncertainty, of change, of disruption, life continues in smaller ways, in quieter forms, but it continues. And that's really the story here, not just of the sea peoples, but of the entire late Bronze Age world, a system that became too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on stability, and when that stability faltered, it unraveled, slowly, unevenly, but not completely, because from that unraveling came something new, different, more fragmented, but still very much alive. So as you settle a little deeper into this slow unfolding, just imagine that quieter world. No grand empires dominating the landscape. No vast networks stretching across the sea. Just smaller communities finding their way, adapting to new conditions, building new identities. And somewhere in those communities, descendants of the sea peoples, or whatever they once were called, living, working, blending in, no longer mysterious invaders, just people, which, in the end, is what they probably were all along. And next, we'll gently drift into how this new world begins to rebuild and reconnect. Because even after everything falls apart, humans have a habit of putting things back together. Not the same way, but in a way that works, eventually, and slowly. Very, very slowly. All right, we'll keep drifting forward. No sudden movements. No dramatic turns. The world has already done enough of that. So here we are, a few generations after the great unraveling. The fires have mostly gone out. The palaces are still ruins, and the people are still here, living, adjusting, trying not to think too hard about how much has changed. Because when change happens slowly enough, it doesn't always feel like change. It just feels like normal life. And that's where things start to get quietly interesting. Because while the old Bronze Age system is gone, something new is beginning to take shape. Not all at once. Not in a coordinated way. just gradually, like a fog lifting very slowly. Now, one of the first things we notice is the return of trade, not the massive, interconnected network of the late Bronze Age. Nothing quite that ambitious, but smaller, more local exchanges, goods moving between neighboring regions, ideas traveling along with them, people reconnecting bit by bit, which makes sense, because humans are naturally inclined to connect, to trade, to communicate. Even after a collapse, those instincts don't disappear. They just adapt to the new reality. Now, along the eastern Mediterranean coast, those former Sea People settlements, the ones that quietly took root, begin to stabilize. Communities like those associated with the Pelé set, now firmly established in places like Ashkelon and Ekron, they're no longer newcomers. They're locals, with their own traditions, their own identities, their own place in the regional landscape. And over time, they begin to interact more consistently with their neighbors, the Canaanites, the emerging Israelite groups, other coastal communities. And while there are certainly moments of tension, there's also exchange, trade goods, cultural influences, even shared technologies, which is how cultures evolve, not in isolation but in contact, even when that contact begins a bit awkwardly. Now, if we gently move inland, we start to see the rise of new groups, smaller societies, organizing themselves in the absence of large empires. Among these are the early Israelites. At this stage, they're not a unified kingdom. Not yet. They're more like a loose collection of tribes settling in the highlands, forming communities, developing a shared identity over time, which is a slow process. Very slow, but steady. And as they grow, they begin to interact with the coastal groups, including those with Sea People's origins. Sometimes peacefully, sometimes less so, but always within this new, more fragmented world. Now, let's pause for a moment, because one of the more subtle but important shifts during this period is the way power is organized. In the Bronze Age, power was centralized. Big kings, big palaces, big systems. Now, it's more distributed. Local leaders, smaller centers of authority, more flexibility but also more instability, which means that alliances, conflicts, and relationships are constantly shifting. It's a dynamic landscape, less predictable, but also more adaptable. Now, over in Greece, something quietly remarkable is happening. After centuries of relative simplicity, the Greek world begins to stir again. Slowly, very slowly, communities grow, trade expands, and eventually writing returns. In a new form, the Greek alphabet, which is adapted in part from Phoenician scripts. And the Phoenicians are another key piece of this puzzle, because while many of the older powers declined, the Phoenicians based along the Levantine coast begin to thrive. They become skilled traders, sailors, connectors, establishing routes across the Mediterranean, founding colonies, sharing goods and ideas. And in doing so, they help knit the region back together, not into a single system, but into a network, flexible, resilient, less dependent on any one central power, which is perhaps a lesson learned quietly from the collapse. Now let's gently return to the sea peoples, or rather, their descendants. Because by this point, they're no longer seen as something separate. They've become part of the regional fabric. Their distinct origins gradually blending with local cultures. Their identities evolving. Which is why, when we look at the archaeological record, we don't see a clear, lasting sea people's culture. We see influences, traces, hints of movement and mixing, but no single, unified identity. And that's important, because it reminds us that history isn't always neat. People don't stay in clearly defined categories. They move, they adapt, they merge. And over time, those distinctions fade. Now, there's another quiet shift happening as well. And that's in technology. We touched on iron before, but here we start to see its full impact. Iron tools and weapons become more common, more accessible, which changes the balance of power. You don't need to rely on distant trade for tin. You can produce what you need closer to home, and that empowers smaller communities, gives them more independence, more resilience, which fits perfectly with this new, decentralized world. Now, of course, not everything is peaceful. There are conflicts. There are struggles for territory, for resources, for influence. But they tend to be smaller in scale, more localized, less about massive empires clashing, and more about neighboring groups negotiating or disagreeing in more immediate ways, which, again, feels more human, more relatable, less grand, but more real. Now, as we move further into this period, something interesting happens. People start to forget, not completely, but gradually. The memory of the late Bronze Age world, the great palaces, the vast networks, begins to fade. Stories change. Details are lost. Events become simplified or mythologized, which is how we end up with things like epic poetry. Stories of heroes, of great wars, of legendary cities. Echoes of a past that is no longer fully understood, but still remembered in fragments. And somewhere in those fragments, there may be distant echoes of the collapse, of movements, of conflicts, of people arriving from across the sea, not as sea peoples, but as part of a larger story. Now, let's just sit with that idea for a moment, because it's quietly fascinating, the way real events, complex, messy, multi-layered events, slowly transform into stories. Simpler, more structured, easier to remember, but less precise. And in that transformation, the mystery grows. Which brings us gently back to where we started. The sea peoples, who they were, where they came from, what they wanted. And the truth is, even after all this, we still don't know completely. We have theories, connections, clues, but no definitive answer. And maybe that's part of what makes them so interesting. Not the destruction, not the collapse, but the uncertainty. The way they sit at the edge of history, just out of reach. A reminder that not everything can be neatly explained. Not everything can be fully understood. Sometimes all we have are fragments. And that's okay, because those fragments still tell a story. A slow, winding, quietly unfolding story of a world that changed, of people who moved, of systems that broke and reformed, and of a mystery that still lingers like a distant shape on the horizon. So as you relax a little deeper into that thought, let the details soften. The names, the places, the theories, all gently blending together into a calm, drifting narrative. Because next we'll explore how later historians and modern scholars have tried to piece all of this together, and how even now the debate continues, softly, patiently, without ever quite reaching a final answer, which honestly feels very appropriate for a story like this. Alright, we'll keep drifting. By now, the ancient world has settled into something new. The chaos has softened, the movement has slowed, and we, comfortably removed from all of it, get to do something humans are very good at, looking back and trying to make sense of things, which sounds simple, but rarely is. Because the further back you go, the fewer answers you get, and the more interpretations start to appear. And the sea peoples? They are an absolute playground for interpretation. So let's gently wander into that, not in a rushed, academic way. More like flipping slowly through a stack of theories, some neat, some messy, some slightly overconfident. Now, for a long time, historians really liked the idea that the sea peoples were a single, unified force, a kind of ancient coalition, a big group of outsiders banding together, sailing across the Mediterranean, and deliberately, systematically bringing down civilizations. It's a very satisfying image. Clear cause, clear effect. Nice and tidy, which is usually a sign that it might not be entirely accurate. Because history, as we've been gently discovering, doesn't really do tidy. Still, this theory held on for quite a while, partly because of Egyptian inscriptions, especially those from the reign of Ramesses III who, as we've mentioned, was very keen on documenting his victories. In those inscriptions, the sea peoples are described almost like a coordinated invasion. Different groups listed together, arriving at once, which makes it tempting to imagine a kind of alliance, a grand plan. But there's a small, quiet issue. Those inscriptions are propaganda, very well-crafted propaganda. And propaganda tends to simplify things. It turns messy situations into clear narratives. Good versus bad. Us versus them. Victory versus defeat. Which is great for morale. Less great for historical precision. So while Ramesses III may have faced multiple groups at once, that doesn't necessarily mean those groups saw themselves as united. They might have just happened to arrive around the same time, which from Egypt's perspective felt like one big problem. Now, as archaeology developed and more evidence came to light, historians started to soften that idea. Instead of one big invasion, they began to think in terms of multiple movements. Different groups from different regions moving for different reasons. Sometimes overlapping, sometimes interacting, but not necessarily coordinated, which feels more realistic and also more complicated because instead of one explanation, you now have many, and each one needs to be considered carefully, slowly, without rushing to conclusions. Now, one of the more popular modern approaches is something we touched on earlier, the idea of systems collapse. Not a single cause, but a combination of factors. Climate change, economic strain, political instability, migration, all interacting, all reinforcing each other until the system simply couldn't hold. It's less dramatic, less cinematic, but also more convincing because it reflects how complex systems actually behave. They don't usually fail because of one thing. They fail because of many things happening at once. Now, there's also been quite a bit of interest in climate data. Tree rings, ice cores, sediment layers, all the quiet scientific ways of reconstructing ancient environments. And what they suggest is that around the time of the late Bronze Age collapse, there were significant shifts, periods of drought, reduced rainfall, environmental stress, which again doesn't cause collapse on its own, but it adds pressure. And when systems are already stretched, that pressure matters. Now, another theory, one that pops up from time to time, is the idea of internal rebellion. The suggestion that some of the sea peoples weren't outsiders at all, but local populations rising up, breaking away, and being labeled as invaders by those in power. It's an interesting idea because it flips the perspective. Instead of mysterious outsiders causing chaos, you have insiders responding to conditions and being described in a certain way, which is something we see throughout history. Labels depending on who's doing the labeling. Of course, like most things in this story, the evidence is partial, suggestive but not definitive, which means the theory sits there alongside the others, quietly waiting, occasionally gaining attention, occasionally fading. Now, let's gently talk about archaeology again, because for all the uncertainty, archaeology has given us some very tangible clues. Burn layers in cities, changes in material culture, new settlement patterns, all of which point to disruption, movement, change. But they don't always tell us exactly who is responsible or why. They just show us that something happened, which is both helpful and slightly frustrating, like finding footprints without knowing who made them. Now, one of the more fascinating aspects of modern research is how interdisciplinary it has become. Historians, archaeologists, climatologists, even geneticists, all contributing pieces to the puzzle, trying to build a more complete picture. And sometimes those pieces fit together nicely. Other times, they don't quite align, which leads to discussion, debate, occasional polite disagreement, and every now and then not so polite disagreement. But we'll keep it calm. In the end, what we're left with is not a single answer, but a range of possibilities, a spectrum of interpretations, all circling around the same central mystery. Now, here's the gently ironic part. The more we study the sea peoples, the more we understand the context, the systems, the environment, the less we feel the need for a single, simple explanation. And the more comfortable we become with complexity, with uncertainty, with the idea that history doesn't always resolve neatly, which, in a way, is its own kind of resolution. Now, let's just pause here for a moment. Because after all this, all the theories, all the evidence, all the careful analysis, we're still left with a quiet question. Who were the sea peoples? And the answer softly is, we don't fully know. We have ideas. We have connections. We have fragments. But no final, definitive conclusion. And that's okay. Because sometimes The value isn't in solving the mystery. It's in exploring it, in following the threads, in understanding the world around it, and in recognizing that even in uncertainty, there is meaning. So as you settle a little deeper into this slow, drifting narrative, let the mystery remain, not as something frustrating, but as something gently intriguing, a quiet reminder that the past is not always fully accessible. And that's part of what makes it worth visiting, again and again. And next we'll slowly begin to draw everything together, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a calm reflection on what this whole story quietly tells us about collapse, about change, and about people who, like us, were just trying to find their place in a shifting world. All right, we've come a long way. No need to wake up just yet. We're not rushing to the finish line. We're just gently arriving. The ships have mostly docked or disappeared. The cities have fallen or been rebuilt into something smaller. And the sea peoples, whatever they once were, have quietly dissolved into history. So now we do what humans tend to do at the end of a long story. We reflect, softly, without too much urgency, because the late Bronze Age collapse and the mystery of the sea peoples isn't really about one group or one moment. It's about something a bit broader, a bit more familiar. It's about what happens when complex systems start to strain, when everything is connected and everything depends on everything else, and then something shifts, not dramatically, just enough. A little less rain, a few delayed shipments, some political tension, a few groups on the move. Individually, none of these things are catastrophic, but together, they add up. And eventually the system can't quite keep up. It doesn't explode. It doesn't collapse all at once. It just slowly stops working the way it used to. And that's what we've been drifting through. A world that didn't end, but changed. Now, the sea peoples sit right at the center of that change. Not necessarily as the cause, but as part of the process. Part of the movement, the pressure, the transformation. And the reason they feel so mysterious, so hard to define, is because they weren't one thing. They were many. Different groups, different motivations, different journeys, all overlapping in a moment when the world was already shifting. And over time, those distinctions faded. They settled. They adapted. They became part of the new world, which is why, when we look for them now, we don't find a clear, lasting identity. We find traces, hints, fragments, a bit of pottery here, a settlement pattern there, names and inscriptions written by people who were understandably a little stressed at the time. And from those fragments, we build a story. Not a perfect one, not a complete one, but a meaningful one. Now, here's the quietly comforting part. Even after everything fell apart, life continued. People kept going. They farmed. They traded. They told stories. They raised families. They adapted to the new conditions and slowly built something different. Not the same as before, but not empty either. And in that new world, new cultures emerged. New connections formed. New ideas took shape. The Phoenicians expanded their trade networks. The Greeks began their slow rise out of the so-called Dark Age. Small kingdoms formed grew, changed. And the Mediterranean once again became a space of interaction, movement, exchange, not as centralized, not as tightly controlled, but perhaps a little more resilient, a little more flexible, which is something. Now, if we gently step back even further, there's a pattern here, one that shows up again and again across history. Complex systems grow. They connect. They become efficient, powerful, impressive, and also fragile, because the more interconnected they are, the more they depend on everything working just right. And when something disrupts that balance, even slightly, the effects can spread, slowly at first, then more quickly, until the system has to change. And that change isn't always comfortable, but it is part of the process. Now, this isn't a warning, or a lesson, or a dramatic conclusion. It's just an observation, a very calm one, because the people living through the late Bronze Age collapse didn't know they were part of a collapse. They were just living, responding to challenges, making decisions, trying to adapt, just like people always do. And in that sense, they're not so different from us. Now, as we come to the end of this long, slow drift, let's return briefly to the image we started with. A coastline, ships on the horizon, people arriving, uncertain but determined, cities in the distance, some still standing, some already fading, and a world in transition, not ending, just changing. The sea peoples moving through it, not as a single force, not as a clear answer, but as part of the movement, part of the story. And then gradually they fade, not because they disappeared completely, but because they became something else, part of new identities, new cultures, new histories, which is in its own quiet way a kind of resolution. Not a neat one, not a final one, but a gentle one. Now, as you rest there, let the details drift. The names, the places, the theories, all softening, blending, becoming less distinct. Because that's how history often feels at a distance. Not sharp and precise, but hazy, layered, full of echoes. And somewhere in those echoes, the sea peoples remain, not fully understood, not fully explained, but still present. A quiet mystery carried across time. And that's enough for tonight. So take a breath. Let the story settle. And if your mind drifts, just let it, because the past will still be there. Slow, patient, waiting, just like it always has. All right, just a little further. No need to fully wake up. We're not starting anything new, just gently circling back. Because even though the story in a traditional sense has already ended, the sea peoples in a quiet, persistent way never really do. They linger, not in the ancient world, but in ours. In books, in documentaries, in late-night thoughts that begin with, "Wait, but who are they actually?" And that question, simple as it sounds, has a kind of staying power. So let's rest with that for a bit. Not to solve it. We've already accepted that's not really happening tonight, but to understand why it keeps returning. Now, part of it is obvious. Humans like mysteries. We like gaps in the story. places where the narrative isn't complete, because it gives us room to imagine, to speculate, to gently fill in the blanks, even if we know we might be wrong. And the sea peoples are almost entirely made of blanks. We have names but not clear identities. We have depictions but not explanations. We have consequences but not a single, simple cause. It's like looking at a painting where half the canvas has faded. You can still see the outlines, but the details are gone, and your mind naturally tries to restore them. Now, over the years, this has led to quite a range of ideas. Some careful, grounded in evidence, slowly built. Others a bit more enthusiastic. Let's just say not every theory has aged gracefully. There have been suggestions at various points that the sea peoples were everything from displaced Mycenaean warriors to early Mediterranean pirates to entire populations fleeing environmental disaster to, occasionally, something much stranger. We won't linger on the stranger ones. We're keeping things calm. But the variety itself is interesting, because it shows how a lack of clear answers invites creativity and sometimes projection. People tend to interpret the past through the lens of the present. So in times when migration is a major topic, the sea peoples become migrants. When conflict dominates the narrative, they become invaders. When environmental concerns rise, they become climate refugees. And none of these perspectives are entirely wrong, but none of them capture the full picture either, because the past, like the present, is rarely just one thing. Now, modern scholarship tends to be a bit more cautious, a bit more comfortable with uncertainty. Instead of trying to pin everything on one explanation, it looks at patterns, movements, interactions, systems under stress, which, as we've gently explored, paints a more complex but also more realistic picture. And in that picture, the sea peoples are part of a larger story, not the headline, not the sole cause, but one thread among many. Now, here's something quietly fascinating. Even though we don't fully understand the sea peoples, we understand the effects of their time quite well. We can see the changes in settlement patterns. We can trace the shifts in trade. We can follow the rise of new cultures and the fading of old ones, which means we understand the transformation, even if we don't fully understand the people who help drive it. It's like knowing the outcome of a journey without knowing every step along the way. And in some ways, that's enough. Now, let's gently consider something else. The idea of identity. Because one of the reasons the sea peoples are so difficult to define is that identity in the ancient world wasn't always as fixed as we might imagine. People moved. They intermarried. They adopted new customs. They changed languages over generations. So even if we could go back and ask someone, "Are you a sea person?" they might not know what that means. Or they might give an answer that doesn't fit neatly into our categories, which is a quiet reminder that the labels we use are often modern conveniences, helpful but imperfect. Now, as we slowly come to rest, there's one last thought we can sit with, and it's a very gentle one. The idea that not every mystery needs to be solved to be meaningful. The sea peoples don't give us a clear answer. They don't offer a tidy conclusion, but they do offer a window into a moment when the world was changing, when systems were shifting, when people were moving, adapting, responding. And through that window, we get a glimpse of something familiar. Not in the details, but in the patterns. The way complexity builds and sometimes falters. The way people respond when conditions change. The way new worlds emerge from old ones. It's all there, quietly, waiting. Now, as you settle into the final moments of this slow drift, let the story soften even more. The sea peoples no longer question to answer. Just a presence, a shadow on the horizon, a reminder that history is not always clear, not always complete, but always quietly unfolding. And that's enough for tonight. So rest. Let the ancient coastlines fade. Let the ships disappear into the distance. Let the names, the theories, the fragments drift away, because the story doesn't need to continue. It already has, for thousands of years, and it will quietly continue long after we've stopped trying to explain it. Good night. All right, just a little more drifting. You're probably already half asleep, which, honestly, is perfect for this part. Because what we're about to do isn't really new information. It's more like letting everything we've talked about slowly settle into place. Like sand after a wave. No sharp edges. No urgency. Just a gentle continuation. Now, even though we've said the end in a very calm, reassuring way, history, as you've probably guessed, doesn't really have endings. It just keeps going, very quietly, very persistently. And the world that emerged after the late Bronze Age collapse didn't stay still. It continued to change, to grow, to reconnect. And in those changes, we can still feel the distant echoes of everything that came before. Now, let's imagine just for a moment a few centuries after our main story. The Mediterranean is busy again. Not in exactly the same way, but busy. Ships moving between ports. Merchants negotiating quietly. Small kingdoms watching each other with polite suspicion. And somewhere along those coastlines, descendants of the people we've been talking about are living their lives, not thinking of themselves as sea peoples, not remembering a grand migration or a collapse, just existing, farming, trading, arguing over very ordinary things, which is, in a way, the most complete transformation of all. Because when something becomes ordinary, it stops being remembered as something extraordinary. Now, as time moves forward, new powers begin to rise. The Phoenicians expand even further, establishing trading posts across the Mediterranean, eventually reaching places like Carthage, which will later become a very important city. Very ambitious, but we're not rushing there. We're staying calm. Meanwhile, in Greece, those once quiet communities begin to organize into something new. City-states. Small, independent, often competitive. Places like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, names that will later become very familiar. But right now, they're just beginning. Finding their shape, developing their identities, slowly. And over in the Near East, new empires will eventually rise. The Assyrians, for example, will grow into a major force, organized, efficient, not particularly known for being gentle, But again, that's later. For now, we're just noticing the pattern. Collapse followed by reformation. Fragmentation followed by new connections. A cycle, not perfectly repeating but echoing. Now, let's gently return one last time to the sea peoples. Not to analyze them, not to solve them, just to acknowledge them. Because even though they don't leave us a clear identity, they do leave an impact. They appear at a moment when the world is already shifting, and they become part of that shift, part of the pressure, the movement, the transformation. And then they fade, not dramatically, not suddenly, just gradually, as their descendants blend into the cultures around them, as their names stop appearing in records, as their distinct presence becomes less distinct, until eventually they exist mostly as a memory, a label, a mystery, and perhaps that's the most natural ending they could have. Not a grand finale, not a clear resolution, just a quiet merging into history. Now, there's something oddly peaceful about that, because it reminds us that not everything needs to stand apart to matter. Some things shape the world and then become part of it, invisible but still there. Now, as we slowly, very slowly bring this entire drift to rest, there's one last image to hold on to. Not a dramatic one, just a simple one. The Mediterranean Sea, calm, stretching out in every direction. Ships moving across it as they always have, carrying people, goods, stories. Some of those people we remember clearly. Others we don't. Some leave behind monuments, inscriptions, detailed records. Others leave behind fragments, and sometimes just questions. But all of them were part of the same flow, the same long, continuous movement of history. Now, as your thoughts drift and the details soften even further, let everything we've talked about blend together. The palaces, the droughts, the migrations, the quiet rebuildings, all part of the same slow story. No sharp beginning, no final end, just movement, change, and time doing what it always does. So, if you're still listening, you don't need to hold on to every detail. You don't need to remember every name. Just let it fade. Because the story doesn't disappear. It just settles. Like the sea peoples themselves. Quietly, gently, becoming part of something larger. And with that, we'll let the waves smooth everything out. No conclusions. No final answers. Just a calm horizon. And the quiet understanding that some mysteries are meant to stay a little out of reach. Good night. Alright, this is probably the softest place we can land this story. No new invasions. No fresh collapses. No dramatic revelations waiting around the corner. Just the final drift. Because at this point, the sea peoples aren't really arriving anywhere anymore. They've already arrived. They've already passed through. They've already dissolved into everything that came after. So what we're left with is not a story of movement anymore, but a story of echoes. And echoes are quiet. Now, if we gently sit with that idea, we can see something important about the way history behaves. The sea peoples are remembered because they appear at a moment of transition, a hinge point, when one world, the tightly connected Bronze Age system, begins to loosen, and another world, more fragmented, more local, more flexible begins to form. They sit right in the middle of that shift, which makes them feel important, mysterious, almost symbolic, even if in reality they were likely just people moving through a changing world. Now, as we've slowly walked through this entire narrative, something subtle has been happening underneath it all. The story has been getting less about who did it, and more about what happens when systems change. Because the further we zoom out, the clearer it becomes that no single group, no single event can fully explain it. Not the sea peoples, not the droughts, not the political instability, not the trade disruptions, but all of it together, overlapping, reinforcing, unfolding. And that kind of complexity is harder to hold in the mind, so humans naturally simplify it. We give it a name. We turn it into a group. We call them the Sea Peoples. And suddenly, 1,000 moving parts become one label, which is understandable, but also incomplete. Now, there's something almost comforting about realizing that even ancient civilizations struggled with complexity. They didn't fully understand what was happening either. They just experienced it, one season at a time, one shipment at a time, one political crisis at a time, just like people do in every era. Now, if we gently return to the archaeological record one last time, we don't see a clean break. We see layers. Burn layers, yes, but also rebuilding. New settlements built on older ruins. Cultural blending. Gradual shifts. Which tells us something very simple, but very important. The world didn't end. It changed shape. And that change is what we're really looking at. Not an ending, but a transformation. Now, as we let the Sea Peoples fade into that transformation, we can think of them less as a single story and more as a label placed on a moment when everything was already in motion. A moment when people moved because they had to, because conditions changed, because systems shifted, because life continued. And in that continuation, new identities formed. Old ones disappeared, and the world reorganized itself quietly without announcements. Now, as this final part settles in, there's nothing left to resolve, nothing left to uncover, no final theory that ties everything neatly together. Just the recognition that history, especially ancient history, often behaves like this. Incomplete, fragmented, open-ended. And that's not a flaw. It's just how time works. Because most of the time, people don't realize they are living through events. They're just living. So if we gently zoom all the way out now, the Sea Peoples become something softer. Not invaders, not heroes, not villains, just people in motion. Through a world that was changing faster than it could explain itself. And eventually, that motion becomes memory, and memory becomes story, and story becomes mystery, and mystery becomes something we return to again and again, not because it has a final answer, but because it doesn't. So as we finally come to rest here, let everything drift apart a little. The names, the theories, the maps, the empires, all loosening, all fading, until there is only the quiet idea left, that history is not a straight line, not a clear narrative, but a long, slow, unfolding movement of people adapting to change. And somewhere in that movement, the sea peoples passed through, and then moved on, and the world kept going, as it always does. So now you don't need to follow it anymore. You can just let it settle. Let it quiet down. Let it end the way most things in history quietly end, without realizing they were ending at all.
Good night.